Is this crazy? We stand on the verge of the 4 greatest years in the history of Make America Great Again. How can you be against it?
Trump is mad at the courts, mad at the Federal Reserve, and he doesn't seem like he wants to listen to either one of them. Welcome to Sidebar from the Washington Post. I'm Rhonda Colvin, here alongside James Hohmann and JM Rieger. And today we're going to dive into Trump's feuds with 2 other parts of the federal government, the Federal Reserve and the courts. So let's start off with the focus of Trump's wrath this morning. Jerome Powell, chairman of the Federal Reserve. Now, Powell was in front of the Economic Club of Chicago, and he said tariffs are likely to at least temporarily cause inflation. Let's listen to what he had to say.
The level of tariff increases announced so far is significantly larger than anticipated, and the same is likely to be true of the economic effects, which will include higher inflation and slower growth. Tariffs are highly likely to generate at least a temporary rise in inflation. The inflationary effects could also be more persistent.
Now let's look at how President Trump responded to Powell's remarks. Here's what he put on Truth Social. He said Jerome Powell is too late, Jerome Powell of the Fed, who is always too late and wrong. Yesterday issued a report, which was another and typical complete mess. He goes on to say that Powell should be terminated and that termination cannot come fast enough. So let's start off with the basics. What is the Federal Reserve and why is Trump so angry at Powell's comments?
I mean, the Federal Reserve is a very critical institution, at least how the United States is currently structured now economically and politically. It's the central bank of the country and basically controls the money flow with that interest rate that we always hear about in news reports. And that's how much that's the rate at which banks can kind of borrow from the Fed. It sets how much money really is kind of flowing into the economy. How easy is it for an American to get a home loan or a car loan? What does that interest rate look like? So in terms of the financial system, the Fed is really central, and it does many other things as well. But that is really kind of the main frontline core function there of the Fed. So when you have President Trump here talking about interest rates, something he's been fixated on for years with the Federal Reserve, what he's really talking about is I want to have more control over the levers of the economy. When I'm doing this on the economy, when it comes to tariffs, I want to be able to do that when it comes to interest rates. The risk here for Trump, among many, is that when you start to throw political levers, the Federal Reserve is fully independent here. They're governed by a board of governors. And if you start to throw kind of political machinations into that, influences into that, it could undermine confidence in the economy. We're already seeing a lot of uncertainty show up in the markets, in the stock market, in the bond market. And if you throw in political uncertainty into one of the main institutions of the U.S. economy, it adds even more uncertainty to that equation.
And James, just, directly and bluntly, can Trump terminate Jerome Powell?
Most likely no, but it is an untested legal question. And Trump has maintained that he can. Powell has said publicly that Trump cannot fire him. It's one of those things like Trump firing the heads of independent agencies that would end up going to court. But we know from our reporting that Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has been telling White House officials to cut out this talk because this is spooking the financial markets. Federal Reserve independence is critical to the U.S. being a magnet of investment from around the globe. If people think that monetary policy, that is the interest rate and the amount of cash and liquidity that's in the economy, is being set for short-term political purposes rather than what's best for the economy in the long term, the U.S. becomes a much less attractive place to do business. And this has always been sort of a challenge because the president gets to appoint the Federal Reserve. The irony in all this is that Donald Trump appointed Jay Powell to be Fed chair during his first term. Joe Biden reappointed him. Powell has another year left on his term as chair. He actually has until 2028 as a member of the Federal Reserve Board. And so I don't think Trump's actually going to fire Powell. What I think he is doing is looking for scapegoats. He's looking for people to blame when the economy suffers because of his tariffs and trade policy. The other big contrast is Jay Powell actually came through in a big way for Trump in early 2020 and for the economy. He dumped trillions of dollars in liquidity, really reduced interest rates, and basically made it so that the COVID shock would not push the US economy into a depression. This time, we've now in recent years had a persistent problem with inflation. Everyone remembers their prices going up, and Powell has been raising rates to bring inflation under control. And he actually has, until Trump basically screwed it up, been remarkably successful at managing things where inflation has come down and we hadn't gone into a recession. And his job under this bill that passed the Senate a century ago under Woodrow Wilson, more than a century ago, 110 years ago, basically says the Fed's job is to focus on keeping inflation under control and keeping unemployment down. And so those are his responsibilities. And so basically he's saying inflation is already going to go up when there's shortages because of tariffs, when things cost more. And so cutting interest rates at this point would just mean more inflation. And that would be against his basically fiduciary duty as the chairman of the Federal Reserve. So Powell is asserting his independence. Even though he was a Trump nominee, Trump is raging as he did in the first term, and it's one of those things where I think Trump is playing with fire, but until he actually acts, he's not touching the hot stove quite yet.
It reflects not only Trump's kind of want for more control over the whole federal government, but it also reflects the contradictions that are inherent at this point to Trump's economic policy. When he's putting these tariffs on, we know that tariffs, at least temporarily, are inflationary. Every economist will tell you that. And so Powell is trying, and that's basically what Powell is saying in that clip there, that there's a chance here that this is going to increase inflation, these tariffs. These are much bigger than we were expecting, and we might have to act at the Federal Reserve. But he's not tipping his hand. He is just laying out possibilities there of the different ways that this can go. But he's also trying to keep unemployment low. And there is a scenario here where the policies that Trump is pursuing right now might force the Federal Reserve to basically choose one or the other in terms of keeping rates low to keep unemployment down, but then inflation spikes, or vice versa. They raise rates to keep inflation in check, but we start to see unemployment rise. And this is going to be a really difficult balancing act potentially for the Fed on this. And on top of that, Trump and the Trump administration like to kind of play this back and forth game on the dollar and how strong they want the dollar to be. And depending on which day you catch them, they'll give you a different answer, honestly, on this. But the Federal Reserve is sort of crucial to that, as is the bond market, which we've sort of made allusions to and talked about a bit on this show, which is Trump wants the dollar to be strong. He wants to maintain the reserve currency. But one of the Trump administration's big goals and ideas is to bring down the value of the dollar somewhat to reduce debt payments. And you can't necessarily square that circle, but that is one of the things that they're talking about. So when we hear Trump talk about the Federal Reserve and interest rates here, it's not only control over maybe short-term economic stuff, the liquidity that James was talking about, but it's also this broader picture of how they really want to reshape the U.S. economy.
Yeah, so his anger at Powell, it actually goes back, even though Powell is someone who was nominated by Trump, but he was very critical of, Trump was critical of Powell during the Biden administration. JM, talk a little bit about that this is not just the one time we've seen criticism toward Powell. Trump doesn't seem like he's been friends with him in the last few years.
No, I mean, he was pressuring Powell in his first term he was critical of Powell in his first term. Then he was critical of Powell under the Biden administration. He warned him over the summer. He warned the Federal Reserve, don't cut rates before the election, worrying about that might give kind of a boost to the economy right before the election and give an advantage to the Democrats. That was kind of Trump's argument and thinking. I will say, though, that also this whole notion of Trump wanting more say over monetary policy, over interest rates, he floated in August. He said that I think that the president should, I'm paraphrasing here, but I think that the president should have input over interest rates. So this gets back to that the Fed is supposed to be independent. That is one of the reasons why the dollar is the de facto reserve currency of the world right now. And if you start to throw in a political calculation into that and doing what Trump's wanting to do here, or at least what he is alluding to, that turns everything on its head.
Yeah. James, I was thinking about what you said about Powell possibly being a scapegoat, that if the economy tanks, if there is this global recession, then Trump is laying the framework to point the finger at Powell. It is interesting because other people have been saying, these tariffs, this is not good for us. This isn't good for the globe. I'm thinking of Jamie Dimon with JP Morgan. He has, given extensive comments on what this might do to the economy. And even there was some Wall Street Journal reporting from someone you know well, who said that Trump did listen to Jamie Dimon's interview on Fox Business right before he decided to do that pause. So it seems like he may be listening to some, and others he's going to fight with over the same exact thing, because essentially Dimon has said what Powell just said.
Totally. I mean, the bond markets forced Trump's hand because all of a sudden, the money doesn't lie. And last Wednesday, they really were looking at a true financial crisis. Like, we were on the verge of what could have been a financial crisis. And now you see, Trump is trying to clean it up a little bit. So today, Giorgia Meloni, the Italian prime minister, is at the White House. And Trump and she had a joint avail right as we were coming on the air, where Trump said, we're going to have a deal with Europe. And Meloni said, well, I can't negotiate on behalf of all 28 countries in the European Union, but yeah, we're going to negotiate it. We're going to talk. We're going to figure something out. So Trump is trying to signal to the markets, like, we're going to resolve this. We're not going to keep in place those large reciprocal tariffs that were announced. Now, the devil's always in the details. Things can fall apart, et cetera. But I think Trump did, to some degree, get spooked by the bond markets, especially, and Jamie Dimon and other people coming out there. Jay Powell is just telling the truth. He's saying what is objectively true, which is that these tariffs were bigger than people expected. Tariffs cause inflation, and that therefore you have to hold off to see what the impact is going to be. He's making sort of a very objective statement in his sort of classic understated way, but I think Trump is raging about that because he sees it as like somehow disloyalty, and he wants the control.
I also think it's just important to note here too, because as we're talking kind of the really important macroeconomic components of all of this, there is a real world effect of what Trump is saying about the Federal Reserve, the same way that there's a real world effect of Trump's tariffs. Now, Trump's tariffs are maybe a little easier to wrap your head around because you're like, okay, if this costs this to import, then the price might go up to this. And that's but this is the same thing. If Trump is kind of putting his fingers in the kind of economic pie here and pulling some levers more so than presidents have tried to do really ever before, right? Trump is going further than any president ever has in terms of what he's saying about wanting to control interest rates. That is going to have a tangible real world impact on people's day-to-day economic lives if he were to really try and follow through and be even somewhat successful in this play. I think that there are a lot of hurdles potentially that he's going to have to jump over here before we even kind of get closer to that, different from the tariffs, which was a little more immediate. But we're talking about uncertainty on steroids. We're already at kind of market watchers, economists will tell you uncertainty is as high in some cases as they've ever seen it in the modern market, at least since maybe the 2008 crash. But if Trump were to follow through on what he's talking about with the White House controlling interest rates at the Federal Reserve, that is going to skyrocket uncertainty. That's going to impact markets. That's going to impact the bond markets. That's going to impact everything, and everything that people touch on a day-to-day basis in the economy is going to be affected.
It's really classic Trump. So since the Fed started in the 19-teens, like, presidents have always tried to kind of, you use cutouts, you use go-betweens. There's famous stories from the Reagan administration where Ronald Reagan and Jim Baker were sitting on a couch and the chairman of the Fed was on the other couch. And like, Jim Baker was like, well, what, I think you should, and Reagan didn't say a word, but it's like the president conveying, but then what he clearly wants, but then the president can go and say, I never told the chair what to do. And like Biden, his National Economic Council chair was Lael Brainerd, who had been the vice chair of the Fed, who had a lot of relationships with the Federal Reserve. They call them governors. They've always sort of, the Fed kind of knows what every White House wants. And this is just Trump being like, you know what, I'm just going to go on Truth Social and I'm going to go and say, this is what I demand. And it's just doing sort of there's been a lot of like winking and nodding. And that is how you kind of break these shatter these norms.
And there's a number of ways this plays out, by the way, that don't go all the way to him firing Powell or even going in and trying to directly, I don't even know how that would work necessarily, but directly control interest rates to what you're talking about. And this gets back to him just kind of pushing a bunch of buttons and seeing how far he can push things.
Yeah, and speaking of the uncertainty, just the idea of potentially terminating, in Trump's words, terminating Jerome Powell. I noticed something that Senator Warren said, and she's been a critic of Powell, but she said on CNBC that she warned that if he is terminated, that could make the markets crash. So to JM's point, and also James, what you've been saying too, is that we are in such uncertain times that the market is so sensitive to even just the thought of even more uncertainty. So I guess this is a story we'll be continuing to follow, and that will continue on.
And there's going to be, Trump is going to have to nominate someone new, and the Senate's controlled by Republicans. Republicans have not shown a lot of willingness to stand up to Trump. And, that person's only going to need 50 votes because J.D. Vance can break the tie. And I think the markets will be watching closely for is it an independent person, or is it someone who literally is just going to do the White House's bidding and do whatever Trump says? And I think that there are Republican senators on the banking committee who are going to want someone who has integrity and independence.
All right. Well, next up, we're going to talk about another area of government that President Trump is unhappy with, and that's the courts. There appears to be a brewing standoff with the Trump administration and the courts. So we'll be talking about that up next. The Trump administration's standoff with the courts went to another level this week as a federal judge said he would launch an investigation into whether Trump officials should face criminal contempt charges for defying his order not to remove Venezuelan migrants from the United States. I think this is a story that everybody's been following. Everyone wants to know every twist and turn. Why do Trump officials seem to be digging in their heels over this issue and not complying with court orders?
I think this comes down to kind of two things here, among others. One is there's been a consistent theme for Trump for easily 2 years. You could even stretch back to his first term, trying to centralize power and expand executive authority. And there's a bunch of people around him who are also pushing that and this theory of, whether you want to talk unitary executive theory, other things like that, where expanding Article 2 authorities as much as possible. And then that gets to kind of part two of this, which is the Trump administration believes that, in the case of these deportations, for example, that should be solely within the executive branch's authority to conduct what they would say is foreign policy and whatnot, and the courts should not be intervening in that. It is I suppose novel is the most generous way of characterizing that way of approaching things. It's not, this has been out in, especially conservative legal circles for a while at this point, but Trump is really trying to push the envelope here more so than we've seen, at least in some time in the executive branch. And, but it is pushing us into uncharted waters because he's been asked a few times now over his first, not even 100 days here, will you follow court orders? And it seems like the real mushy part here is the spirit of the order, right? Because they're trying to, in the case of this man who was deported to El Salvador, who the Supreme Court has agreed with the lower court saying you need to quote unquote facilitate the return. They are trying to basically do kind of a legal limbo dance, it feels like, on that. But yes, it has pushed us into an entirely new level and layer of this conflict between the executive branch and the judicial branch.
Yeah, and if we step back just a little bit to explain this, what the judge said yesterday, what happens if the judge finds federal officials in contempt of court? This was criminal contempt. So that would be referred to the DOJ. And of course, the DOJ is under the control of the White House, the executive branch. So what would happen next in this case?
So there's two separate cases. It's easy to get them confused, but there's the guy from, because it's all here. there's two separate cases. There's the El Salvador gentleman who lived in Prince George's County, Maryland, who was picked up and the government says is MS-13. He denies it. And then there's this Alien Enemies Act situation, which was sort of the flights with everyone, not just this one person who had a 2019 order saying he couldn't be sent out of the country. And so Jed Boasberg, who's this federal judge, the Supreme Court has basically taken the Alien Enemies Act case away from him by saying that these people have the right to challenge their removal, but they have to do it in the place where they're living. So basically that kicks to a bunch of individual cases instead of one big case. And it also means that these cases will be fought in Texas and Louisiana and Oklahoma, which are much more conservative. So what Judge Boasberg has done is say, look, I don't have the underlying case, but the rule of law means that you have to follow a judge's order, and there's Supreme Court precedent to back that up. And so Boasberg is saying it is very clear. He cited Washington Post reporting that you sent planes after I said not to, and I said turn the planes around, and they landed. And I want to know who made the decision to ignore a court order, because it's really central to our Constitution that you have to respect a co-equal branch. And the Trump administration is already appealing it. They're saying that they have state secrets privilege so that they don't have to reveal this information. And so what Judge Boasberg can do is he can basically compel people to come testify as witnesses to say, who gave you the direction not to turn the plane around. And he can bring he can bring any number of people, immigration people. So then he has not actually found the government in contempt yet, or individuals. This is exceedingly rare. But what could happen, and there's a 1987 Supreme Court case that allows this, is the Trump Justice Department certainly wouldn't prosecute a Trump official. But Judge Boasberg actually has the ability to appoint a private lawyer to bring a case against an administration official for criminal contempt. And that person could then theoretically serve up to 90 days in federal prison. It seems very, very unlikely. When it's happened, it's usually people have been for like days or hours, and but it ultimately gets to this, like, the spirit of the law. Like, do you follow the spirit of the law or not? And it does seem pretty clear in this case that the administration basically gave the middle finger to this judge, and now he isn't defending. It's not about his ego; it's about defending the rule of law and the court system.
You did have a case with both officials in the Clinton and Bush administrations who were held in contempt, but it was only fines involved. This was in the 90s and the early 2000s over mismanagement of funds in a trust for Native Americans. So there is some precedent, but to James's point, this is exceedingly rare. I will also just point out that Trump is saying that in the case of the Maryland man who was deported down to El Salvador, and saying, well, there's nothing we can do now. He's out of our jurisdiction. It is a little ironic for the administration that loves to talk about the art of the deal and the deal maker in the White House saying we can't do anything here, as they're getting Americans out of Russian prisons and other deals that they're cutting around the world. And they love to brag about their ability to cut deals. But in this case, when he has a very close relationship, by the way, with El Salvador's leader, they're saying in this case, there's just nothing that they can do. So there is just a political component as well there, that where the Trump administration's trying to have it both ways.
Yeah, I've been thinking of the politics behind this too, because there are a lot of people interested in this story, because it's very concerning. And I was reading yesterday that there was reporting that some officials with the Trump administration want this fight, that this falls in line with campaign promises of deportations. They feel like this is something that wins with their base. We're seeing more video. I don't know if you both saw the video of a man who was at a New Hampshire courthouse, and he was tackled. He was there for a court appearance. He was tackled. Another bystander gets in the way too. It's a very, you have a visceral response when you see people tackled, especially by people who are wearing masks or face coverings. I'm just wondering, is it all politics? Is this basically what it is? Is that Trump may want to just defy the courts just to win some political points?
Trump wants to deport 1 million people. That's the number he set, and that's very hard. And if it gets bogged down in case by case legal fights, he's never going to get anywhere close to that goal. And I think he has this sense that he has a mandate for mass deportations. And I mean, the Trump people want it to be a fight about this, like Abrego Garcia in Maryland. This morning, the Trump administration put out a protective order that his wife took out against him 4 years ago when she said she feared for her safety. And the wife or the lawyers are saying, oh, it was out of an abundance of caution. They've solved any problems in their marriage. Yesterday, Pam Bondi released some stuff to try to make the case, I think, it was a stretch, but to try to make the case that he's a gang member because he was, when he was caught outside of Home Depot, he was wearing a Chicago Bulls hat and had money. And I mean, it's stuff we've talked about before on Tuesday. But that's not really what this is about. And I think like the risk is it's not, I mean, this guy might be a bad guy, but there is a judge who ordered in 2019 that he not be sent to El Salvador. The government knew this. They sent him anyway. And that's like, I mean, it's sort of, it feels esoteric, but it's not. It's about whether a judge's orders matter or not. And if they don't, then nothing, no judge's order matters, And so like, I think like the Trump folks want us to be like arguing about whether this is a good guy or not. And it almost is, it is beside the point. It doesn't matter. And
to just kind of put an additional point on how uncharted of waters we are in right now. We've had the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Roberts, twice in the last 6 months, basically try to reaffirm in public statements the independence of the judiciary. And most recently, kind of admonishing the Trump administration for floating that, oh, maybe we just start impeaching judges if we don't like their rulings, right? And we've heard some members of Congress, some Republicans float that as well. This is not normal to have a Chief Justice. That does not happen for a Chief Justice to feel the need to make public statements like that. The Supreme Court does not. They want to kind of live behind their rulings and let that speak. So when you have the Chief Justice making a public statement, that shows you, in some ways, I think, a window into how they're thinking of this as well. The case will play out, and we will, like, they're appealing these things, and we will see kind of where this ends up. But it is also important to point out, I think, to James, sort of what you were getting at, which is Stephen Miller has said that part of the goal is to act so fast that the courts can't necessarily weigh in quickly enough. And one of the real risks here is that you create a situation where maybe they're acting in what is ultimately found to be illegal, but the courts are not able to act quickly enough to stop those actions, so they de facto go into effect. And the Trump administration is trying to do that. And they've basically said as much, that they're trying to act as quickly as possible on some of these things before the courts or before Congress can kind of weigh in. And I think this is the latest iteration or kind of manifestation of that we're seeing.
Yeah. Well, James, thank you for the conversation today. I think we'll be talking about these things for a while because they are developing stories. And thank you to our listeners and viewers of Sidebar. We will be back again next Tuesday. I'm Rhonda Colvin with The Washington Post. Have a great day.